Okay. So thanks everyone for joining. This is Karen Whitaker with the League of American Bicyclists. And we'll be talking about federal policy, both what's going on right now in Washington, and then, how we're starting to think about the next transportation reauthorization and how you can help be part of that. Okay. So what I'm going to talk about today, a little bit about what's new, what we've seen in the implementation of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, what I'm thinking about for 2024 and and what I'm thinking about that for that reauthorization period, and some of the bills that we've seen introduced recently as sort of they're marker bills, or they're sort of test balloons for transportation in the next reauthorization. So I'm going to start now, and I'm going to start talking about the budget and the appropriations process, because if you're watching the news, they're talking a lot about the fact that the Congress just passed a bill today so that half of our government didn't shut down. So to give you an idea of what the budget process is supposed to look like in Washington, by their own rules, the White House is supposed to send their budget over to Congress in early February. That's when we have the State of the Union. And then Congress by April 15th is supposed to set that top budget language, and the House and the Senate are supposed to agree. Then they break it up into 12 bills. Those bills work through subcommittees and the committees, and then they vote on it. And the fiscal year is supposed to start on October 1st. So you don't need to know all those details. I just wanted to give you a sense of what it's supposed to look like, and then what it looks like in terms of the fiscal year 2024 bill, which we are in right now. And that is that because we were slow on the 2022 budget, President Biden didn't send over his budget until March. The House and the Senate never agreed to that top line dollar, but nevertheless, each chamber passed their own set of bills, and they were actually kind of ahead of the game by the time we got to September. But then they couldn't agree between the House and the Senate on what those numbers should look like. So we don't have a federal budget because we can't have a budget until both the House and the Senate agree to the exact same thing. So just this week, Congress has extended the budget to March 1st for transportation and some other pieces, and then March 8th for the defense budget and some other pieces there. Okay. So if you're wondering how this affects transportation, it affects us in a couple of ways. One, most transportation funding will keep going even if the government shuts down. But what we do know is that state DOTs they're a little more hesitant to build projects if they're not sure sometimes. So we see that. The other things that we're affected by, in particular in the current budget, is that the 2024 fiscal year, is that one, for all of you who were at the summit last year, one of the things we asked for was, please mute yourself if you're not muted. Thanks. So one of the things we asked for last year at the summit was for Congress to require NHTSA to test truck side guards or side underride guards with vulnerable road users like bicyclists and pedestrians. That report language is part of the Senate budget bill. It's not in the House, but it is in the Senate. So I'm really hoping we get that into the next budget, but we need Congress to pass a budget to get that language in. So that's one thing we're looking at. So we have that there. The other thing is there was some bad language in the House bill that would make it harder for USDOT to implement their equity action plan or to implement their greenhouse gas emissions performance measures. So we'd like those things in the House not to be in the final bill. But because it's already January and the president and the White House is supposed to be putting forward their next budget in February. Hey, folks, please mute yourself. Thanks. Because we're waiting for that, there's things for next budget that we're watching for. We're watching for funding for the Active Transportation Infrastructure Investment Plan, the Healthy Streets, or funding through the CDC for Active People, Healthy Nation. And that's funding to promote physical activity. All right, so I got a question about okay, Terry, we'll get to your question at the end. Okay, thanks. So that's sort of what's going on in Congress right now, but the US DOT is still working to implement the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or the IIJA. And one of the things now we've seen is that the RAISE grants are now open, and those applications are due February 28th. So you may want to check in to see if your local government is doing something on biking and walking, or whatever project they're doing should have a multimodal component. And so that might be a place where you can engage. The RAISE grants, they're for hard to build projects, things that are either multi-jurisdictional, so cross a borderline, or they're multimodal projects. So 50% are required to go in urban areas, 50% rural areas. There's a set aside for disadvantaged communities, but it is a program that biking and walking projects have done really well on. Complete Streets have done really well, because this US DOT is looking for those projects to include complete street types elements. And this picture is of the Circuit Trail, which is around the Philadelphia area, but also goes into New Jersey. And it was started through what was then a Tiger grant, but is now a RAISE grant. And now they've got a plan for 270 miles of bike lanes, or excuse me, trails, and about almost half of that's been built. So this was sort of the catalyst that got that going. Oops. Another thing, we expect the Safe Streets for All grants to come out in February. And these grants cover both Safe Streets for All doing safety action plans, or if you have a safety action plan, you can apply to actually get one of the projects in that plan funded. One of the great things about the program is that they've extended or expanded what a planning grant can do. So it can either fund the actual safety action plan, or it can fund other planning activities around that plan. So if you want to do a demonstration project, like, and these are examples of demonstration projects here. On the top one, I think it's Burlington, Vermont, they're making a buffered bike lane. So it's something that you can put in. It has to be sort of a quick build or temporary. And then once you build it, you can, you can try it out. Leave it in for a month, 3 months, something like that. We found that to be a really helpful way to get a community used to that type of project. On the bottom one, you can see they did bulb outs around a sidewalk. Okay. So this is something that's coming up in February. It's something we've seen that has been really helpful for local governments to get those plans underway. And once you have a plan, and once you have those projects in plans, it becomes that becomes easier to get those projects funded. The other thing we're hoping to see is the Active Transportation Infrastructure Investment Program. We've talked about this a little bit before, and the goal of this is to help a community build out their active transportation network. So these pictures are from Oakland, California. The one on the top left is from the year 2000. The one on the bottom right is from 2020. So you can see the difference they made in 20 years. The goal under this program, though, is to allow communities to build that faster, to not have to do one project a year. over and over, but to get that funding to do a bunch at once. It can also be used to build what they call spines, which would be a trail in between the two. Okay, so this goal, you know, or this program, I expected it to be out in February, but I am guessing that USDOT may be waiting until they get a federal budget. Because as long as we're on last year's budget, this program, ATIP, was funded in last year's budget. And so right now we're just on a continuation of last year. So as long as that continuation lasts, this program is going to accumulate more and more money. It is possible, but I think it is unlikely that it will be funded in this year, the FY24 budget. So I think that's what they're trying to do, get all the money before they put out an application. So I don't think it will be funded for FY24, but it is an ask that we will make to get it into the fiscal year 25. So the next thing that I really wanted to talk about today is the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So I use these interchangeably, know that I'm talking about the same piece of the same legislation. The administration likes to call it the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. Congress often likes to call it the IIJA. So that's why I use both, because so I'm sorry if I confuse folks, but it's one piece of legislation that we're talking about. And that is the bill that passed in 2021. So this is a little bit of the timeline. It passed in 2021. The next one's coming up in 2026. And so it's actually time to prepare already. So it passed in 2021. The next year, USDOT spent a lot of time releasing guidance and instructions to the state DOTs saying, here's the new law, here's how we want you to implement it. So we've had 2 years of that. And now this year, interest groups like the League in Congress, they're sort of shopping around ideas for the next reauthorization. So, because in January 2025, that's when the next, the debate is really going to kick off in Congress. And it's a little bit frustrating because I feel like, you know, it's a 5-year process. We're trying to base our next asks on just 2 years when infrastructure takes so long. At the same time, we want to stay on the same timeline that Congress is on, so that our bills and our ideas are considered as part of that. So here's the Bike League's reauthorization timeline. Starting in the fall last year, I had some brainstorm sessions with our National Bike Summit state coordinators. Starting today, I'm going to release a survey for both state and local leaders or practitioners, and also advocates, Bike League advocates, and then finally, the Association of Pedestrian and Bicycle Professionals. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. In March at the National Bike Summit, I'm going to share the results of those surveys. We'll also make it available to others after the summit. But I'll also have some of our key advocacy partners. So we'll have Transportation for America, we'll have NRDC, we'll have the Advocates for Highway and Auto Safety, all sort of talking about what their priorities are for reauthorization. And it's a good chance for us to sort of hear what people are thinking about. I want to get your thoughts as we develop ours, because we're still, this is really the planning session. So there's still an opportunity to change things, make sure that whatever change we ask for is going to be as valuable as possible. So at the summit, we'll have that conversation with some of our partners. Through the summer, I'm going to start sort of sifting through what those top asks are and talking to folks in Congress to see if we have someone who's like, yeah, I want to lead on that. I really like that idea. In the fall, we'll start to get down to actually writing some of that legislative language and go back to everyone, to all of you, to national partners, to our congressional leads. And then for the 2025 summit, we'll have our new priority legislation. So that's the timeline. So when we talked about the survey, for citizen advocates, there's a lot of questions about like, what are you seeing in your community right now? Are you seeing an increase in interest? Are you seeing an increase is your local government, do they seem more open to the idea of building biking and walking? Are you seeing more people biking and walking? Or on the flip side, are you having a situation where there's debates in your town to pull out bike lanes or things like that? I want to sort of get a sense from you what you're seeing. And then what do you wish your community was doing more of? What do you think is sort of the most important thing for us to be working towards? For the second one, for the state and local organizations, and this will also go out to APBP, which is our practitioners, so planners, engineers, folks like that. The survey also has some specific questions about different funding sources. And these are some of the programs I'm looking at. I'm also going to ask questions about what is slowing down implementation projects. Is it the environmental side of things? Is it a different part of the permitting process? And what I would say is that if you have knowledge on these programs, I'd love for you to take this. If maybe you haven't used any of these programs, but except for Safe Streets for All, you can just skip the other questions and just talk about Safe Streets for All. The more information, the more sort of, experiences from people on the ground that we can get, the better it's going to help us build a platform that's going to improve biking and walking in the future. I also want to address some of the unfinished business from the last National Bike Summit. We haven't forgotten those things. These things are still super important. There was the Sarah Debick Lankenkamp Active Transportation Safety Act. We'll probably be talking about that at the summit again. I see this as something that we really want to push for. Basically, what this bill does is it makes it easier for local governments and state DOTs to work together to fund biking and walking safety infrastructure. It fixes a snafu in the language in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law that we didn't know. So it's within transportation alternatives. It would make it easier for a project to be funded at 100% federal funding using transportation alternatives and then safety dollars. The other thing we asked for, we talked about this, truck side guards. We need for Congress to pass a budget to know whether or not we got it. So that's where those two bills are. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about those programs we're going to ask about in the survey and give you some updates on what we're seeing. So first of all, transportation alternatives is, it's a very small program within the transportation bill, but it has been the source of roughly 50% of all federal dollars came from transportation alternatives, at least before IIJA or the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. FHWA hasn't released the numbers yet for 22 and 23. So that's one thing I'm going to be watching, but just know this has been a really critical piece because it's something that local governments can access. Yeah. So some of the changes we saw in IIJA or the bill, we saw a huge increase in funding, 70%. States are now allowed to use some of the funding for technical assistance. And that's one of the questions, I'm really interested in. Has your state used the technical assistance? How has it helped? Or have you not seen a difference? That's really helpful to know. We know that it did make it harder for states to transfer transportation alternatives funding to another program. And we know that's worked. Arizona, for the first time, funded transportation alternatives projects outside of the large metropolitan areas. So from 2013 to 2020, they didn't do that at all. They just transferred that money. But now they actually ran a project and they ran a competition and they got a ton of applicants. So that's been really good. Texas, same thing. They used to transfer half of it right away. This past year, they didn't do that. And they offered the technical assistance and they just awarded $345 million of biking and walking projects or transportation alternatives projects in that state for 1 year. So we are seeing that work. Another thing the bill did is it gave some flexibility on how the state meets the local match. So we saw that in Louisiana. Louisiana was able to use that to help the really small rural communities get more of this money out. And in Ohio, they were able to use some of their safety dollars for that. So we're really happy to see those examples, but I would love to know any more or any issues you've seen with it. Just to give you an idea, one of the things we watch is whether or not states are using their dollars or whether or not they're transferring the dollars. So this first map looks back at pre-IIJA. So this is up to 2021. And what we can see is the states have done a really good job. Now, if you are in a yellow state or a light green state, your state has a lot of money that they should be using. And so, it's worth going to them and say, please run another transportation alternatives competition. Like, we know there's some funding, but overall, we're really happy with these numbers. What it shows for me when I'm talking to Congress is that this is a wanted program, and that the states are using it and the local governments want to get the funding. So this is post IIJA, and you can see a lot less of it is out, but that's okay. States have 4 years to use it. We do like to see those higher numbers. Like I just told you, Texas just awarded $245 million. That was in October. So they've awarded it. They haven't obligated it. And to clarify, obligated means they've put it under contract. So those projects are ready to be built. So the money in Texas is sort of in that middle stage, right? It's been, the project it's going to has been identified, but it hasn't been, a contract hasn't been signed to build that. But we do see some states are already over that 80%. One of the things we know Idaho does is that if they choose a project and they know it's going to take 3 stages, they don't make that local government apply for 3 years in a row to get that funding. If they give them the first stage, assuming the project works well, they've planned for them to have the second and the third year of funding. So those are some examples of that. And if you're wondering how your state is doing, Safe Routes to School does this chart, which tracks every state. So there's a couple things we're looking at here. We're looking at the obligation rate, that we know that the funds are moving to a project on the ground. We're looking at the amount going to technical assistance, because we know those are the states we want to go back to. And we know that there are states that are giving technical assistance that aren't recording it here. So they may be using other funds, or maybe that's recording error. I don't know, but that's something else that we're interested in looking at. And then the last column is this funds lapsing. As I said, the funds are good for 4 years. So this is also a place to watch. And I just put in the chat a 1-pager with a bunch of the links from the things I'm going to talk about today, including this. So, and thanks to Safe Routes Partnership for pulling this together. Super helpful. Some of the changes we're still interested in is we still, even though like Ohio was able to find a way to use its safety dollars as a match, it's been really difficult for every other state, and we had wanted that to be easy. So that's what the Langenkamp bill fixes. So that's something we're still pushing for. Something else I'm really interested in hearing from folks on is how can we reduce the time and the issues around the permitting process. One thing I'll talk about in a little bit, that USDOT has made it easier to transfer projects from federal highways to transit, which we think makes it easier. We're definitely seeing more states transfer projects, not the money, but the actual bike ped project from federal highways to the Federal Transit Agency or the local transit agency. So we're interested in seeing if that's helped. But I'm also interested in understanding where in the process is a project getting delayed. That's the data we don't have. I hear from folks all the time about, oh, it's this permitting process. But when I try to get people together, everyone's got a different piece of it. So something that's important to me is sort of figuring out where in the process are things getting delayed. And then talking about the Highway Safety Improvement Program. So this is a place where we made really big gains in IIJA or bill, and we're starting to see those. Number one, every state had to do a vulnerable road user safety assessment. So they had to look at their state, look at all of the vulnerable road user fatalities and serious injuries. From there, they had to identify the high risk areas. And then they have to come up with what's their solution, what policy or strategy or project or strategy can help fix that. So that is something, if you look at your USDOT site, you should be able to see, but that's something we're interested now that we have the state has listed those dangerous sites, how do we now get them to fix that? Oops, I think I skipped one. Or maybe not. Okay, so that's one of the things, how we get them to fix that. The other part of the bill was that was called the Vulnerable Road User Special Rule Funding. And what this said is that if within your state, 15% or more of the overall fatalities were people biking and walking, then the state had to spend 15% of its highway safety dollars on biking and walking safety. And this is, for most states, this is a huge increase. On average, we're seeing states spend between 1 and 4 or 5%. So for them to have to spend 15, it can make a difference. Now, the thing about this funding is that whether or not you qualify changes every year. So I think last year's funding was looking at 2020 data. This year's funding is looking at 2021 data. So for last year, all the states in blue had to do it, and all of them spent the money. All of them spent that 15%. This is looking at this year, and we did see a couple of changes. Vermont, New Hampshire, Mississippi, and Rhode Island don't qualify this year. They did last year, they don't this year. But Indiana, Ohio, and Virginia cycled in. So if you're in a blue state, one of these blue states, know that this is something that your DOT is going to need to spend money on, that they're going to have more money than they have in the past for most states. So some of the things I'm really interested that we're thinking about and maybe want to change and would love to know your experience. For those VRU safety assessments, whether or not the law requires them to consult with the MPOs. And some states like West Virginia did a really good job, brought them to the table, and they really felt like they were part of it. Some states brought in interest groups. And so that's one of the things, if you're with a bike walk advocacy group, did you know this was going on? Did they bring you to the table? Did they ask for your advice or your help? Because that's one thing we could strengthen that requirement if we wanted to. The other thing, like the Langenkamp bill, we want to make it easy for states to bring in locally identified projects. So if your community has a safety action plan, maybe you got a Safe Streets for All grant, maybe you had a Vision Zero plan, something like that. We want the state to be able to just take those projects and put it in their safety plan so that they can spend federal safety dollars on it. So that's one thing we're looking at. They were allowed to do it this time, but they for the planning process, but not for the funding process. So we want to see if that's something that will work. And the other thing, what I'm seeing so far and what I'm hearing so far is that these plans didn't actually get down to the project level. They got to sort of a strategy, like, oh, if pedestrian serious injuries are an issue at an infrastructure, at a intersection, maybe here's 2 or 3 things we could do. That's helpful, but it'd be better if they could get to, this is what we're going to do at this intersection. it makes it easier to actually get those projects funded. So those are some of the things I'm thinking about. Would love to know the experience. It looks like, yeah, I saw in Illinois, they did involve the stakeholders, which is great. So that's a great best practice. When we're looking at the vulnerable road user special rule, what did they spend the money on? So we heard from one state that they put the money all into these pedestrian countdowns. That's helpful, but I'm not convinced that that was the highest safety use of that money. So we want to see how that worked, and we want to see how that funding for that special rule money, is it linked to those VRU assessments? Again, was it connected to local priorities? And then did this process affect their safety process? One of the things we learned about Virginia and North Carolina is Virginia and North Carolina, they're always on the bubble, right? They're usually between 13, 14, 15, 16% of their fatalities are bicyclists and pedestrians. So the way the law is written is some years they'd be in, some years they'd be out, and it would go back and forth. What we've heard from those DOTs is they said, you know what? We're just going to plan on spending 15% on bike ped regardless of whether we hit the rule or not. And to me, that's that's a great best practice. If you're close to that, you should be spending this money whether or not you're mandated to do it or not. So, if you know of anything interesting that's happening in your state on these, we'd love to know that. So some of the things I'm thinking about for safety next year, obviously we keep the Langenkamp bill. I think that's going to be super important for just freeing up some of those dollars to bike ped projects. One thing is looking at proven safety countermeasures for biking and walking in particular, but in general, and can we create an incentive for states to build those? And then a third is looking at speed management. A lot of you probably know the league, we've been talking a lot about slow roads and reducing speed limits and reducing speed, not just reducing speeding, but reducing the speed of roads. And so we're thinking about how is that going to work in the next federal bill. Now, the things you're seeing underneath, these are what the Federal Highway Administration has identified as proven safety countermeasures, which means they have data that shows that these things can reduce fatalities and serious injuries. As an example, here's a proven safety countermeasures for biking and walking. One thing they've had for a while, for the last few years, is this idea that adding bike lanes reduces crashes. And it reduces crashes for everyone, not just bicyclists. So that's where this 49 and 30% rule came out. At last year's summit, they announced a new proven safety countermeasure, which is that converting traditional or flush bike lanes by making them protected or separated, then reduces crashes 53%. So this is the kind of thing, if we could reduce or give a financial incentive that's going to help states pay for more protected bike lanes, like I think that would be super helpful, or more and better walkways or lighting, all of these things in this box that have been proven to improve safety. The other thing that was new under IIJA, or the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, is that it had a climate title for the very first time. And this is something also I'm looking at to see how states are implementing it, what has been working, what isn't working, how do we, what's the next step? So not actually in IIJA, but something that came out recently was the greenhouse gas emissions performance measures. So by February 2024, every state is going to have to set a goal to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions. And starting in 2020, and they're going to have to do it every 2 years, states every 2 years. Starting in 2026, all those large MPOs, those metropolitan planning organizations, are also going to have to set goals. They do it every 4 years. But right now, the goals that they're setting are not there's no teeth, there's no consequence if they don't meet it. So that's something we're watching. As states do that, how do we in the advocacy community then use that as a hook to get them to think about climate when they're doing project selection? The other thing we did see in IIJA is the carbon reduction program. This is the first time we've seen this. It's slightly smaller than transportation alternatives, so it's kind of a small program, but it is for projects that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So a little bit on how that program has been going so far. These are their obligation rates. So for this, we're looking at funding that has been signed under contract. We've got a project moving, or it's been transferred to the Federal Transit Administration. So it's actually pretty good. I mean, this has been a hard program to get going because, first of all, there were a ton of new programs under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and so states generally started doing the bigger changes or the changes in programs they already knew how to do first. So it's smaller and it's a little bit complicated because it's new. So we expect it to take a little while to get off the ground. But we are seeing, I would say, anything over 50% is pretty good. Doesn't mean you can't do better, but that's pretty good. On the left, there's a list of states that haven't done any of this yet. And there's a couple reasons for that. If we're going to give the benefit of the doubt, one of the things that the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law said is that a state has to write a carbon reduction strategy. And so some states like Massachusetts have said, we're going to write our plan first, and then we're going to start funding projects based on what our priorities are. And so that's a really good way to go about it. Massachusetts hasn't, so they haven't spent any of their money yet, at least not on projects, but they haven't transferred any either. There may be other states on the list that just haven't even started looking at the program. But this is something to talk with your DOT. Like, how are you doing it? How are you choosing your projects? How are you weighting them? And then how are you using this idea of reducing greenhouse gas emissions when you're doing your project selection? So this is one that's looking at the percent awarded to bike ped, and this is where known. So, and this is awarded, right? So this is not necessarily obligated, the contracts haven't been signed. And I want to just let you know I'm comparing data sources yet. The White House, whitehouse.org, has a bunch of maps that show all the projects that have been awarded under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and some others. So it's not exactly apples to apples, but I did think it was helpful to see that there are some places, Virginia, DC, Missouri, they've spent all the carbon reduction program money that they have obligated, they've obligated to bike ped. So that's exciting. And I just wanted to share that. And then the other thing is, within this program, states can transfer up to 35%. And we are seeing some fairly high transfer rates of that funding. And again, that's partially because it's a new program, and maybe they haven't set it up yet, but that's something to watch. And if you're in a darker blue state, maybe something to worry about. So some of the things I'm interested in hearing from you, I'm interested in thinking about as we move forward is, how is your state just approaching this idea of climate programs and a greenhouse gas emissions performance measure? So we've seen, like I talked about Massachusetts, that they're writing a strategy first, and then they're gonna, from there, choose their programs. North Carolina is spending their money, but they're not, at this point, they're not thinking about GHG removal as an overall as an overall aspect of their project selection. They're instead saying, oh, we've got this little bit of money for carbon, we're going to do these projects, and then just sort of adding that letter to their transportation improvement plan. So it's good they're spending their money, but we're not seeing that overall piece. So, you know, if we're putting 30 billion into roads right now, and we're only putting 1 billion into reducing GHG, it's not really evening out. On the sort of the trendsetter or the most progressive things we're seeing in Colorado, they passed a statewide law requiring GHG emissions from their transportation program. In Minnesota, they have a new law requiring vehicle miles traveled reduction. So we're interested to see how those work and what happens there. And is there lessons we can take with that when we get to the federal level? So if you're seeing anything like that, let us know. We'll also report back as we learn more. So what's next? We are seeing there is a marker bill being introduced next week. It's called the Green Streets Bill. It's by Senator Markey from Massachusetts. And the idea is that it's going to strengthen the authority that USDOT has to create a performance measure and then give it some teeth so that if a state is not meeting its performance goal, then maybe it has to shift funding to modes that reduce emissions. It also will require an explanation or a defense of why a state would want to expand highway capacity. And then, yeah, we're also, when we're thinking about changes to the carbon reduction program and looking at those transfer rates, like, what's the problem? What are the challenges that MPOs and the state DOTs are having in implementing that? Is there something we can do to fix that or to move it forward? And then I think the Safe Streets for All program, this map is from that White House side. So these are all the communities that have gotten a Safe Streets for All grant. It's over 1,000 communities and it's 1.7 billion or a little more than 1.7 billion right now. So that's super exciting. You know, I think as I mentioned before, these are grants that can fund implementation of projects if you have a plan or that plan. And I just want to stress again, those planning grants can be used for a lot of new things. And the application to apply is going to come out in February, so watch for that. But there's also been some challenges in these Safe Streets for All programs. One is that the obligation rate is really low. So even though $1.7 billion has gone out, only about 13% of that has been obligated. So only about 13% of that work is actually moving right now. And so one of the things I'm interested, if your community is working on this, like, what is the challenge they're having? Is it the paperwork? Is it the administration piece? We've heard that a little bit. Did they need help from the state DOT and they didn't ask ahead of time, so they're having trouble getting it now? Like, the more we know about those difficulties, the easier it will be for us to sort of make some changes that really gets this moving. The other thing is that because there's been so much money for planning and so many communities have already applied, I think it's time to start thinking about, like, what else can we do under the planning stage? So if you're not ready to build an implementation project yet, or if there's, you know, that health assessment or whatever, we know those things are there. Is there another sort of non-building for planning need that could fall under it? So if there's something that you're thinking about that your community really wants to do, but doesn't have the money to do, that's not the actual building of something, this might be a place for that. The other thing that folks in Washington are talking about is, what does this program look like going into the future? So, you know, one of the thought, like right now, it is what's called a discretionary grant program. So to get the money, a local government applies to USDOT. So once a year, USDOT puts out a notice of funding opportunity. You have to fill out the whole application and send that in and get supporters and all of that. Would it be easier if it was a formula program so that the state got a set of money and all they were doing was reimbursing local governments for projects identified in their plans? You know, that's one of the things we've heard from local governments along the way, is they'd really love to get federal funding directly to the local government versus to the state or the metropolitan planning organization. So there's some thought about that. And if you know, are working with your local government and think, oh, that would be great. Maybe you're in a community where you're like, it's actually easier for us to apply to USDOT than the state. Like, those are the things that would be super helpful. So a couple other things that I'm thinking about, and then we'll have time for a Q&A. I'll go through these pretty quick to make sure we have time. One, at the league, we've been pushing really hard for cyclist automatic emergency braking. There was language in the bill that said that NHTSA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, had to consider vulnerable road users. And NHTSA will tell you they considered it and they don't want to do this. This is something we're thinking about. What's the next step? Because we believe the data is there. We know it's being tested in Europe, in Australia, in Japan, in South Korea. So how do we get it into the US? Another thing, under complete streets, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law requires a set aside for complete streets planning. Here's where all the states are in that process. We know that 31% of states, so I guess 15, are making programmatic changes to require complete streets as a default in that project scoping. How do we increase that? We do know that, I can also tell you there's a bill being introduced next year that would not only require the set aside in planning, but would require the set aside in some of the funding. So I think it would take 5% of state funding that has to go to complete streets projects. Another thing we talked about is shortening the permitting process. So we're looking at if this ability to switch projects from federal highways to federal transit has worked. Another thing in the bill was that now if you are refurbishing or reconstructing, fixing a bridge, doesn't necessarily work for building new ones, but if you're fixing a bridge, you have to add bike ped access if there's bike ped access on either side. So it doesn't have to just be like it's an interstate and there's those roads have access. If you have a trail on either side, which is the case in this picture, then they have to add bike ped access. So that's very exciting. This is from the League retreat. This is our staff. And this is the Frederick Douglass Bridge. And we are all on the pedestrian side. And then you can see the bike lane. Then you see a barrier. And then you see the cars. It's so much better than it used to be. A couple new bills that are coming out. On electric bikes, I know we still have the e-bike rebate out there. We are going to try to work on that to get it. That's a tax bill. There may be a chance at the end of this year, but we may need to do some quiet negotiation versus a large grassroots push. But I did want to let you know that there is a new bill introduced as sort of an idea for the next reauthorization that would do discretionary grants for communities that want to bring e-bike share to disadvantaged communities. There's another about Senator Fetterman has a bill that brings in just a bunch of multiple design issues, would make it easier for states to build multimodal projects by reducing some of the permitting barriers there. And for Safe Streets for All would have a smaller fund for small communities, a set aside. Hopefully to help with some of that administration work, the paperwork to get it going. And this, by the way, is a picture from the new MUTCD. As you can see, they have those protected intersection models. And then there's also a bill, HR 6672, which is to give Major Taylor a Congressional Gold Medal, the Congressional Gold Medal. These congressional gold medals are really hard to do. You need 2/3 of each house. And we have an action alert right now. So it's on that piece of paper that has all the links. You can ask your member of Congress to do that now. All right. So now I'm gonna stop my screen share and open it up to questions. So let's. Let's see where were questions. So I see a question. We're hearing some pushback when using vehicle miles traveled in conversation. Is there a new or better term? I haven't heard of a new term.
Karen, that just came up today. We were talking about some bills specific to greenhouse gases, and yeah, it was the first time I had heard that too. So maybe it's just an Illinois thing, but uh, others agree that were on the call. So other orgs from Illinois. So just I thought it was interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting because Colorado did the GHG reduction and Minnesota did, having learned from watch what Colorado did, thought VMT would be easier. So that, that's helpful. That may be something we should do a webinar and talk more about. You know what? I'm just gonna say, go ahead and raise your hand virtually if you have any questions, and I'll continue looking through the chat. All right. So not hearing any questions. Let me say we really appreciate it if you all could look at those surveys, take the survey, share it with anyone else. If you've got folks who work at MPO or something like that that you think would be interested, let me know. And we actually have a slightly separate one for practitioners, mostly just ask questions about if they work in the public or the private sector. But then the main questions are similar to the state and local advocacy group. Okay, so we are seeing that in Michigan, they like GHG better than VMT. Air quality monitoring.
Well, Karen, I should qualify that they don't like greenhouse gas budgeting either, but they just didn't want to see us promoting a reduction in VMT since it's been such a big part of their planning. They want to increase VMT.
Oh, they want to increase VMT.
It's for them, VMT increase is a sign that the economy is doing well. They tied the two together, and so if you look at their long-term planning documents, when VMT goes down, it means the economy is stagnant.
Yeah. So, and actually federal funding, one of the big things that might be considered this year is how the formula funding is determined. Before 2009, funding was determined through a formula of sort of vehicle miles traveled, number of lane miles, population. And since then, the formula funding has been based on what that ratio was in 2009. So if Congress is really ambitious, they may look at even changing what those formulas are. And that might be an opportunity to think about changing that formula. But I think one of the problems with the greenhouse gas piece is that it's becoming so polarized. And then sorry, I'm reading the chat and it's getting lost. But I think, yeah, so please fill out the survey, consider sharing it with anyone else. The more data we get, the better. And we'll keep you involved as we're thinking about what comes next. At this summit, we're definitely going to do the Langenkamp bill, and we might float out some other potential marker bills. And I did get a question about the vulnerable road user special rule, how it will affect states like Indiana. Okay, so the vulnerable road user, so Indiana, my guess is that Indiana spends maybe 5% of its highway safety dollars on biking and walking infrastructure. That might even be a little bit high. And next year they're gonna have to spend 15%. So that's right, 3 times as many projects. They have the interesting thing about special rule versus any of the other funding I talked about is that under the special rule, they have to obligate it. They have to get it under contract or there are penalties. And it's going to affect their ability to spend other safety dollars, but other like highway safety dollars. So that's why we're seeing 100% compliance with that. So the thing is maybe to talk with your USDOT, see where they're planning on spending it. Look at their safety assessment and see if there's projects there or areas that they identified. Because now that they have that VRU assessment, that's where they should be spending the money. One of the things we're trying to make easier is that if the state has a bunch of transportation alternatives projects and they haven't identified those safety projects, they could use some of that to match the TAP projects. Hasn't worked great, but the big difference is you're probably looking at 3 times as much money being obligated for bike ped safety. Yeah. Scott, you had another question?
I did. And I know we've talked in the past about the maintenance of pedestrian bridges. But I mean, it's a bigger issue for us in Michigan where they're not even willing to maintain, MDOT's not willing to maintain bike lanes, even though they're using federal dollars to build them. And it seems like they should be required under the federal code. Is this a policy topic that could be clarified during the in a new bill, or is this something that we just have to work directly with USDOT on?
So it's a double-edged sword. It is something that could be qualified, that could be dealt with in the bill. Transit projects have to say, if we're going to build this, then we're going to maintain it for 10 years. One of the things that we see, say, in Montana, where the state is in charge of maintaining their bike ped facilities, is they don't want to spend their TAP money because they don't want something new they have to maintain. So that's the sort of back and forth that we've seen.
Well, I would say, I mean, in our case, MDOT is willing to build it if someone else wants to pay for the maintenance and other people don't want to pay for the maintenance.
Yeah,
So
that's
it's
the way it
similar.
works in most states, is the local governments are in charge of the maintenance for biking and walking facilities. But it's helpful, and that's why I would say in that survey, I don't think I asked a specific question about maintenance, but there's a lot of open-ended ones. So if maintenance is something that you're hearing and you have concerns about, write it down, let us know. I don't have an answer right now on how best to fix it without it penalizing in some areas. But, if we identify it, maybe we can talk to other people and sort of figure out what is the best option there. And maybe it's for something like that, those safety dollars or carbon reduction, allowing maintenance to be part of it. Okay, so I see Maryland is also trying to do it. I saw a question on banning handheld cell phones. Yeah, and that Bicycle Colorado is doing it. That is something that is a state level bill. I think we've had, and I can check, I think we've had a template for that, like a model legislation for that, because we're definitely in support of those laws, but it's not something that's going to be addressed at the federal level. We saw the possibility, is there a possibility of a national ban on no turn on red? One of the things in the new MUTCD is said that you cannot allow red turns when there's I don't know if it's now, it might say protected bike lane, but a bike lane on that road that has the right of way. So we're seeing a movement towards that, and that might be something we can continue to push in bills on design standards and things like that. So got a step forward on the MUTCD. We can look for other ways to do that. All right. It's 4 o'clock. Thanks everyone for joining. Got the links to the survey. Please let me know if you have any questions as you fill it out. Please feel free to share it. Thanks, everybody.